Welcome back again to Spotlight. I'm Quentin Wells. Thank you for joining me. This is a very special edition of Spotlight because today I am joined by Dr. Donna Lampkin-Stephens, the regular host of Spotlight and the interim director of the School of Communication. Thank you for joining me.
Quentin, it's nice to be here on this side of the interview set, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you to talk about a pet project.
So, coming up in less than a week even, I think, it's the 200th anniversary on November 20th of this year of the Arkansas Gazette.
The founding of the
Arkansas Gazette, yes. And, obviously you worked there and you've done a lot of research and work and publication on it, like all the set decorations you have, but this is going to be an interview in three parts. I'll start out with a little bit of the history of the Gazette, and then I'll move to a couple other students to talk about its biggest years in the middle, and then, the event there.
The end. The end.
But I'll start out with a little bit. So the Gazette was founded in 1819, since it's the 200th anniversary coming up soon. And so that was founded by William E. Woodruff. Can you talk a little bit about, him founding it, where he came from, and
yes.
stuff like that?
William Woodruff was from New York, and his father died when he was a young boy. And so his mother, he was the oldest child, and his mother didn't have many options, a poor single mother. So she apprenticed him to Alden Spooner, and that meant that he spent time, he worked for this printer, Alden Spooner, and learned the printing trade. And so on his 18th birthday, which I think was December the 25th, whatever year that was, he got his apprenticeship finished, and he was able to go out and make a living. He left New York and spent some time in Tennessee, spent some time in Louisville, I believe, and sort of meandering down from New York. And then in 1819, Arkansas was a territory, and there were lots of opportunities for young and ambitious printers and newspaper men at that time to come to the new territory. And so he brought his belongings, actually a printing press, put it on this boat and came down the rivers from. So it's amazing that when we think about how that even was possible at that time. And he landed in Arkansas Post, which was the territorial capital, which is out near Dumas, Gillette, that area. And so that's where the Arkansas Gazette was founded on November 20th, 1819.
And Arkansas didn't become a state until 1836, I believe. So how is that significant that this paper was founded in a territory that was west of the Mississippi?
It was, the Arkansas Gazette precedes Arkansas as a state. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And it was very important. I got to go to Arkansas Post this summer, and by the way, I would encourage anybody to go there because it's quite a historic. It's a national park, a state park, and it's they had a town, they had a bank, and they had a tavern, and then they had a newspaper, which I think was very important. And if you've seen the reprints of the first edition, it looks nothing like newspapers today. And but I think it was important that the state wanted to know what was going on outside the territory wanted to know what was going on outside its borders. There was news from Europe, very late, and in a couple of years later, the capital moved to Little Rock, and so Woodruff brought his newspaper and founded it in Little Rock.
And so
refounded it, I guess, in Little Rock.
And so in the period between Arkansas statehood and the paper moving to Little Rock, the paper changed ownership several times and went back to Woodruff.
Well, Woodruff moved it to Little Rock, but after the years he would get short of money, so he'd sell the paper, and then sometimes he would buy it back. so it went through multiple sets of ownership throughout the rest of the 1800s.
So when the paper was in Little Rock, that was around the time, or it was in the Little Rock, I should say, at the time period of the Civil War. What did the Gazette cover during the Civil War? Anything significant there?
Well, lots of papers in the South just ceased publication during the war because you had battles for one thing, but you also had shortages of paper and printing supplies, and so after the Civil War was when it sort of restarted.
All right. So after that, it changed ownership a few more times, had some interesting owners there, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes,
possibly?
and really the Gazette found its stride in 1902 when the high school family out of Memphis bought the paper, and they owned it for from 1902 until 1986. So most of the Gazette's glory years were under the high school family, and later the high school Patterson family. He was a son-in-law of the high school daughter.
And the next interview, Katie Wells is going to talk a little bit more about the high school family with you. And so for now, I will turn it over to her.
What will you find at UCA?
The next generation of artists,
educators,
and communicators.
The College of Fine Arts and Communication offers 42 undergraduate and graduate programs of exceptional quality,
contributing to a deeper appreciation of the human experience.
but we also invest in your experience.
With broadcasts, conferences, exhibits, live performances,
publications, recitals, readings, and screenings,
We even offer a unique artist-in-residence program.
featuring performances and master classes with accomplished visiting artists.
All of that experience pays off.
The school placement rates of our music teacher graduates with K-12 certification is close to 100%. We have many disciplines here, but they all share the same dedication to rigorous practice,
And scholarly achievement.
which is why our graduates perform so well.
The College of Fine Arts and Communication at the University of Central Arkansas.
Go here and go anywhere.
I'm Katie Wells, and we're back with Dr. Stephens, and I'm going to continue the interview and talk a little bit about the high school years, which you mentioned are kind of its glory days. So a man named John High School took over the Gazette in 1902, and who is John High School, and what did the change in ownership do for the paper? Was it beneficial? Was it already, great, and it just kind of continued that evolution, or did he really bring some stuff to the table?
Well, it wasn't a very good paper when they bought it. So Mr. High School, and everybody called him Mr. High School because he was so old. But in 1902, he was a young man. His father was a judge in Memphis, Carrick High School. And the family bought the paper. So John and his brother Fred were the two sort of boots on the ground in Little Rock. And they came to Little Rock. He had always wanted to be a journalist. He studied, they didn't have journalism at that time, but he studied at the University of Tennessee and wanted to be a journalist. In my research, I found he had a little paper that he made when he was like 10 years old, and there were parts of it called the Jolly Fellowship. That's what it was called. And so he reported on his neighborhood. So he had journalism in his blood from the beginning. And so when they came to Little Rock, John High School, JN High School, John Netherland, he was sort of the editorial voice, and Fred was the one who ran the day-to-day newsroom, and they were a good pair. Mr. High School was, as I understand it, sort of a little more aloof, and Fred was just loved by the men who worked at the paper, and they wanted to work for him. They appreciated what they did. The high school family reinvested all of most of their profits into the paper. They added pages, they added circulation dates, or publication dates. They actually added a building. The old Gazette building at 3rd and Louisiana Streets in downtown Little Rock still was built in sometime in the early 1900s. It says Gazette. If you've ever been down there to downtown Little Rock, it's now East End Charter School, which is another story. But from the early 1900s until 1991, it housed the paper, and they just made the paper better. They began to hire journalists who had gone to college, many of them at the University of Arkansas. So that you had college-educated people who were covering events. Mr. High School was very involved in the community. He had library card number 1 in the Little Rock library system. He believed that the people should be educated, and he really was a champion for Arkansas, his adopted state.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that he had this character and this presence that he brought to the paper, but he also had journalism tactics that he brought and made the paper so much better. Do you think these tactics have stuck throughout the years, or was it a time of it had a start and a finish, or do you think that they've stuck?
Mr. High School really had both high school brothers had a real fingerprint on what the newspaper became, and I'm going to say that the Arkansas Gazette, was the most courageous, the strongest, the best newspaper that the state has seen.
And the high school years can also be notably identified by the Little Rock Central High integration and the coverage of that whole story.
Let me back up a little bit, Katie,
Okay,
before
yeah.
that. Mr. High School had a son, Carrick White High School, and he was supposed to be the heir apparent. And in the 40s, Mr. High School was in his 70s, and he was looking to, pass the paper down. And his son, Carrick, went off to war, and he was lost. He was killed in World War II. And so that really sort of changed it changed the future of the paper, because Mr. High School didn't have a built-in heir to hand it off to. And it was also a personal tragedy as well. But I've often wondered what would have happened had Carrick High School lived, because as we were getting into Central High in the 1950s, Mr. High School had found, well, let's back up even before that, Fred High School died in 1931. And so Mr. High School was sort of going it alone with some business people still at the paper. But as we were heading into the end of the 1940s, after World War II, he hired his son-in-law, Hugh Patterson, and he hired Harry Ashmore, who was from South Carolina, and he became the editorial writer. Hugh Patterson became publisher. And so I call it in my book this second triumvirate of the Arkansas Gazette.
Okay, well, thank you for
Yeah.
mentioning that.
That sort of sets the stage for Central High,
Yeah, of
because
course.
Hugh Patterson and Harry Ashmore had served in the U.S. in the military, and think about this: they were all fighting fascism, and they come back, and black people could not take full part in society. There was a segregated society. And many World War II veterans came back from the war with these experiences, thinking, we're fighting it over there. How can we come back home to this? And so those two had helped Mr. High School along as the Gazette faced its biggest challenge at Central High.
Yeah. So, with Central High, do you think that the paper and its name would carry the same weight if it wasn't for this moment in history and it wasn't for the Gazette's coverage of it and, great coverage?
That is, no question, Central High was the absolute ultimate height for the Arkansas Gazette. Mr. High School, it was his paper, and Harry Ashmore and Hugh Patterson said, we think we should take this stand to allow these black students to come into school. Think about this. Mr. High School was born in 1872. His father had been a colonel in the Confederate Army in Tennessee. He didn't believe in integration, but he realized that society was changing, and he trusted these younger men whom he had hired to lead him really into modern times, I think you would say. But the Gazette won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the first newspaper ever to win 2 Pulitzers in the same year for covering the same event. So the Gazette won as a whole for public service, and Harry Ashmore won the Pulitzer for editorial writing. And it was certainly, by that time, the Arkansas Gazette was one of the great, great newspapers of the country.
Yes, so I was going to mention the Pulitzer Prizes. If you could sum up with the fact of the glory days and the Pulitzer Prizes, how would you, sum up the high school years and what they did for the Gazette and the impact that it's left?
The Gazette under high school, under the high school family, stood for what was right. And I think any journalism today has to do that. And we can talk more in the next segment about maybe how that was some of the roots of what happened to it at the end. But I think you never go wrong by standing up for what's right.
Right. I'm just going to turn this over to Tristan Hall, and she's going to talk to you about the Gannett years of the paper. Thank you, Dr. Stephens.
Thank you.
Here I am back at UCA. This is where I got my start. Acting in plays, studying literature, writing scripts. Campus has grown so much in the last few years, and the technology is incredible. UCA is where I learned the craft of storytelling and got ready for a career in New York and LA. That's how I got here. Go here and go anywhere. Go UCA.
Hi, my name is Tristan Hall, and welcome back to the Spotlight. I'm here with Dr. Donna Lampkin-Stephens, and we're going to talk about high school turning 100 and into kind of the Gannett years and basically the end of the Gazette. So can you tell me about what having Mr. High School turn 100, what did that do for the Gazette, or what happened?
Well, Mr. High School turned 100 in November, I think November 2nd, 1972, and the family threw him a big party, and he sat at the Country Club of Little Rock and entertained this great crowd of people who came up to wish him well. And everybody who was anybody in Arkansas was invited. They said politicians, advertisers, businessmen and women, and every employee of the Arkansas Gazette was invited to this party. And I think that says a lot about the way the high school family ran its business. And 6 weeks after he turned 100, Jayan High School died. I think he wanted to hold on to get to be 100, and then he died a couple of days after Christmas in 1972. And then, that sort of marked the end of an era, obviously for the Gazette. And then across town, the Hussman family bought the old Arkansas Democrat, which was founded in 1870, so several years younger than the Arkansas Gazette. And the Hussmans had a hard time with the Democrat. It was not a good paper. The Gazette had lost 20,000 subscribers after the Central High crisis, and the Democrat had gone ahead in circulation. But as the years went by after Central High, the numbers came back and the Gazette went far, far ahead. And it was an afternoon paper, and frankly, not very good. The Democrat had not taken any sort of a brave stance in Central High, and so it just wasn't a very good paper. So the Hussman family bought it and tried to turn it around. They owned several small papers in South Arkansas, and they used, so they bought the Democrat, and then really their deadline ran out, and so they went to Hugh Patterson, who by that time was the publisher, and his son Carrick later became editor of the Gazette, and asked if the Gazette would buy the Democrat. And Mr. High School had always thought that you shouldn't own more than one newspaper, that there should be good competition, which helps the readers. And so they turned him down and multiple times. And I think that made Walter Hussman angry. In my research, I found that some people thought that he had been high-hatted, the term high-hatted by this older fellow, and he decided that he was going to go into a full-out newspaper war against the Arkansas Gazette. And so lots of tactics. He switched to a morning publication. He added to his newsprint, and he took on the Gazette head-to-head. Hired John Robert Starr, who was a big blow, but he had people who read him. He wrote a daily column. He was the managing editor of the Democrat, and actually, I think you can see here. There he is down there with a knife between his teeth, and so that's the kind of stunt that they were pulling. And street fighters, really, and the Arkansas Gazette was not a street fighter,
Right.
The Democrat began chipping away at circulation and money, and ultimately Hugh Patterson made the decision to file an antitrust lawsuit because the Hussmans were funneling their profits from their other South Arkansas newspapers and cable television systems into this fight with the Arkansas Gazette. The high school family, Patterson family, didn't have other real assets, only the Gazette. And they believed that it was unfair business practices, and multiple people believed it was unfair business practices, but the lawsuit failed. Hussman won, and shortly after that, the family faced the decision, heartbreaking decision, to either go out of business. And remember, this is 25 years after Central High. I mean, or sell to someone else. And the people they chose to sell to was the Gannett Corporation.
Now, Dr. Stephens, you came in 1984, am I correct? And so you were there
to the Gazette.
To the Gazette. And so you were there when they sold to the Gannett. How did the culture of the Gazette and how did the writing of the paper change once the Gannett came in?
Well, I was young and dumb. I didn't realize how everything was going to come down. Looking back, I can see that it was just a disaster. I don't know what the other alternative was. I mean, they can't continue to lose money, over and over. We thought that Gannett would be our savior because they had, lots and lots of money as a public company, but they were not, as it turned out, as willing to lose money as Walter Hussman was. And Hussman spent millions of dollars in his battle with Gannett, and ultimately won.
Now, did the Gannett value the historical implications that the Gazette had on Arkansas's history, or were they more of just like, let's be flashy, let's be showy, and just put out low quality news?
I hate to say low quality, but they had a completely different, they seemed to come here and say, these people don't know how to put out a newspaper. Let's show them how to do that. And that was so completely wrong. They did not respect the history of the Gazette. They did not respect the people who worked there, who had been putting out a quality product for 170 years. And so that was disappointing that Gannett tended to tart up the old gray lady, is what many people have said. I'm not sure that things had already gone so far, by the time Gannett bought it. I'm not sure it took very long for the end to be clear.
Right.
Yeah.
It was about 5 years that the Gannett took over, and so it was 1991, and then the paper was eventually shut down. Now, with the Democrat, what were they doing as the Gannett was over?
They were trying to put out a good newspaper.
Okay.
They did try hard. I would still argue that the Gazette was better all the way till the end. I think, Tristan, I think many people had, maybe some advertisers, maybe some subscribers, had been very angry with the Arkansas Gazette for the stance it took in Central High. And I think that wound up, I think the Gazette took a brave stance in 1957, but I think that's one of the things that came back to bite it at the end. I would argue they still did the right thing by standing up for what was right. But, so the Democrat, you wouldn't believe the competition. I mean, we would see I'd see a Democrat reporter at a football game or a golf tournament. I mean, we were battling. Everybody had to have the story first. It was great for Arkansas News consumers because you knew what was going on because these two papers were battling it out, and really it was an unbelievable time for actually people to know what was going on because both newspapers were doing a great job at trying to get everything covered.
Do you feel like either newspaper was more reactive to the other one or vice versa? Like
the Democrat was far more reactive. In fact, Mr. High School earlier had said, we don't need to be worried about them. We just need to put out our good product. John Robert Starr would write columns making fun of Gazette reporters and editors. I mean, it was
kind of below the belt.
Very below the belt. Pretty classless, actually. And so that was kind of the thought at Third and Louisiana where we were. People could not fathom that the Arkansas Gazette would go away. You just couldn't believe it. And I didn't hear about these rumors until Labor Day of 1991, September. And by October the 18th, it was over.
Now, what was going through your head while you were hearing these rumors? Did you actually believe that the Gazette will eventually close down or be sold at all?
I mean, people just couldn't believe it. But the word got out that they had sold it to Hussman and he was going to shut down, and the paper was going to close. And that's what turned out to be right. I was working in the Fayetteville Bureau then. I was a sports writer. I was covering the Razorbacks. And so I happened to have a dental appointment in Little Rock on October the 18th, and I cleaned out my office in Fayetteville, but I left everything in my car because I was like, well, maybe when I get back, this will all be settled and we can go back and move back in the office. Instead, I came down after my dental appointment, and we were at the paper. We were sitting around talking to each other. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and then suddenly the computers just went off. And
that's sad.
I mean, people were crying. They had outlawed smoking in the newsroom years ago, but people were lighting up cigarettes. Somebody brought in a bottle of whiskey. People were. I mean, it was so surreal to be there with the people that you had worked with, and I mean, really your family.
Right.
And then the computers went off, and then someone finally came around and said, this is our last day, and we've been sold, and you're all invited to apply at the Arkansas Democrat.
Oh my gosh. Now, Dr. Stephens, in a week, in less than a week, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette will be celebrating 200 years of the Gazette's history. Do you think that they should be doing this, or what is your stance on this?
I'm very appreciative of Mr. Hussman for commemorating the Arkansas Gazette. Gannett closed the paper, and he bought the assets in 1991. He has always said, the paper was dead when he bought it, but he was able to buy the name, and that was a very important thing that he bought.
But he didn't buy the history.
He didn't buy the history, and I think that I mean, you can appreciate the history, and I appreciate that he's going to help us commemorate it, and he has been. They've been running those historic pages, front pages, which I've enjoyed. But the Arkansas Democrat Gazette is not the Arkansas Gazette, and never will be. There's a photograph of William Woodruff hanging in the newsroom, and when I went in there for a meeting a few weeks ago, I cringed because William Woodruff is not the founder of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette.
Right.
It's a completely different history, and they don't need to claim that as their own.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Stephens, for this interview. I'm Tristan Hall. Join us next week for the next episode of Spotlight.